Hello once again. In the fall of 2019, a few months before the pandemic hit, an exhibit that I curated opened at the University of Delaware's Old College Gallery entitled Beat Visions and the Counterculture. It focused on the radical art and literature associated with the Beat movement of the 1950s and 60s, which led directly into the hippie counterculture of the late 60s. As I noted in the introduction of the show, the Beats were perhaps for their fearless commitment to free expression in both art and life. As such, they ran straight up against the conformist culture of 50s America and were the frequent targets of high-profile legal attacks. As it happened, the opening reception for the exhibit, where I was scheduled to give a talk and a tour, took place during the annual Banned Books Week organized by the American Library Association Office for Intellectual Freedom. And so I geared my talk to the topic of the censorship incurred by the writers and artists in the show, starting with two of the founding works of Beat literature, Allen Ginsberg's Howl and William S. Burroughs' The Naked Lunch. Both works had been the subject of major obscenity trials, largely owing to their frank and explicit passages devoted to homoerotic experiences. Prevailing in court, both works ultimately helped to redefine what was considered artistically valid expression, and both are now widely considered major milestones in American literature. There was plenty of other material to discuss in the show, which had a whole section devoted to what were ultimately failed attempts at censorship. The Beats found common cause with comedian Lenny Bruce, who was arrested multiple times for using obscene language on stage in his routines. A writer named Leonore Kandel explored female sexuality in a poetry collection called The Love Book, which was seized for obscenity in 1966. A poetry publication by Diane DePrima and Leroy Jones called The Floating Bear was confiscated by postal inspectors for obscenity and for, quote, containing derogatory remarks concerning the United States government and government officials, unquote. And the editors put on trial. And here it's interesting to note that Leroy Jones's son is none other than the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, Ross Baraka, who was recently arrested by federal agents for trespassing, supposedly for trespassing when he visited a migrant detention facility in New Jersey, before charges were dropped and the prosecutor reprimanded by the judge for abusing the legal system for political ends. So at the time of my exhibit, 2019, the lesson about censorship seemed simple. Back in the 1950s and 60s, authorities had been threatened by the freedom of expression the Beats championed and had tried to silence it. But they had failed in these attempts. The brave defenders of freedom of expression, the artists and writers, their publishers, their lawyers, their supporters, bookstore owners, all had fought back and prevailed. And we could safely consign such overt censorship, at least in America, to the past. True, in the 1980s, there had been several high-profile attempts to censor gay, female, and non-white artists in the name of public decency, led by Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina, and a New York political figure you may have heard of named Rudy Giuliani. But again, these attempts, despite gaining some initial traction, had ultimately backfired. But, in the words of Frederick Douglass, here we are today contending for what we thought we gained years ago. From 2000 to 2020, in any given year, a modest 273 book titles were challenged in libraries and schools nationwide. And for a country of 300 million, that's It's not good, but it's not terrible. But then things dramatically changed. In 2021, the number of challenged books suddenly shot up nearly tenfold to over 1,800. The next year, it was over 2,500. In 2023, there was a 65% increase from the previous year to 4,200 separate titles, almost 20 times what it had been just 3 years previously. The vast number of these challenges related to either racial or LGBTQ content and focused on books geared to children and adolescents. So what happened? A big factor was the founding in January 2021 in Florida of a group that called itself Moms for Liberty, formed in reaction to the COVID mask and vaccine mandates and lockdowns, but also in response to the Black Lives Matter movement and the reckoning around the killing of George Floyd, who was murdered in Minneapolis exactly 5 years ago today. Moms for Liberty was also vehemently opposed to LGBTQ rights and the growing acknowledgement of gay and trans families and kids, though one of its 3 founders became embroiled in a bisexual sex scandal shortly thereafter. And you can look that up for the salacious details. Moms for Liberty was connected to the right-wing Proud Boys group as well that led to the Capitol riot of 2021. And they led to the so-called parental rights movement and the bill dubbed Don't Say Gay, introduced in Florida the following year, which limited discussion of sexual orientation and identity in Florida classrooms. Books were removed from library and classroom shelves, curricula censored for references to race and sexuality. Much of this was portrayed as protecting children from ideological coercion and so-called wokeism, a linguistic perversion of what was originally the admonition within Black communities to stay woke, that is, stay alert to police brutality and other injustices, but now used by those on the right to refer to political correctness and social justice crusades. Florida's war on woke became a template for many states and now for the current administration, which has targeted diversity, equity, and inclusion as some sort of nefarious threat. While claiming that it was fighting censorship, the incoming administration swiftly introduced a long list of words to avoid and that it sought to remove from existing government documents. Words like race, gender, sexuality, environmental quality, climate science, LGBTQ, oppression, privilege, female, women, hate speech, identity, victim, tribal, etc., etc. It's a long list. And in one ham-handed example, photographs of the B-29 bomber that dropped the atom bomb on Hiroshima were scrubbed from a Pentagon website because the plane was named the Enola Gay, after the pilot's mother, who was named Enola Gay Tibbets. You may have read that in recent weeks, under the current administration, hundreds of books, mostly related to LGBTQ identity, have been removed from the military service academy, or racial identity, have been removed from the military service academy libraries. At West Point, courses were canceled mid-semester, speaker invitations withdrawn at the last minute, and research projects are now subject to political review. Among the books removed, notably, are those by women of color, including Maya Angelou's celebrated autobiography, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And the point has been made that they kept Hitler's Mein Kampf, but they got rid of I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. So, tells you something. Some tenured faculty and senior library staff at West Point and the Naval Academy have resigned in the face of these attacks on intellectual freedom, and out of dismay that the leadership at these revered institutions of learning has so quickly capitulated to what, by any standards, are infringements on academic liberty. And the irony is not lost on us that these leaders of military academies, in failing to stand up to violations of core constitutional principles and attacks on the integrity of their institutions, are showing perhaps the worst trait possible in military culture, namely cowardice. In the past few months, we have seen craven fear on display from powerful law firms, large corporations, media organizations, and universities. News outlets have been pressured, sometimes successfully, to modify their reporting and editorial positions. Longtime corporate sponsors have pulled out of pride celebrations. But we've seen many profiles encourage as well the refusal at all levels to submit to what amounts to government censorship of speech. And as Frederick Douglass said in this regard, there must be no concessions to the enemy. An example of the danger of such concessions came to my attention literally as I was writing this, when a news story appeared on PBS that PBS had censored a documentary about the cartoonist Art Spiegelman, ironically on the very theme of free speech. A 90-second segment where Spiegelman made comments critical of Donald Trump was required to be removed at the last minute, or PBS wouldn't air the program, out of fear of offending the president, who has threatened funding for public television. But after the now censored program ran, Trump still demanded that PBS be totally defunded. We can see that capitulating to censorship or self-censoring out of fear only adds to the power of the censor. On tour in England, Bruce Springsteen recently said to his audience that authorities in the United States were persecuting people for using their right to free speech and voicing their dissent. And in response, as if to prove Springsteen's very point, Trump posted that Springsteen ought to, and this is in all caps, keep his mouth shut until he returns to the States, and, quote, then we'll see how it goes for him, unquote. So a veiled threat. So what is this, the reason for this threat that causes such a visceral reaction? Fear around free speech really goes both ways. If rulers seek to incite fear in order to quash speech, it is because they themselves are afraid. As the great Unitarian minister Ellery Channing said of freedom of speech, there is nothing which tyrants so much dread. Frederick Douglass echoed him a half-century later when he said the right to free speech of all rights is the dread of tyrants. It is the right which they first of all strike down. They know its power. As Channing said in 1812, if wise and good men abandon the right of free discussion, if awed by threats they suppress their convictions, if rulers succeed in silencing every voice, but that which approves them, farewell to liberty. These words were spoken from the free pulpit of a Unitarian church barely 2 decades after the Bill of Rights was ratified, and it's worth noting the values shared by the early American Unitarian Church and the founding fathers, including James Madison, largely responsible for the First Amendment. Channing was not speaking in the abstract. Speech against the War of 1812 was being met with violence and accusations of treason. Similarly, Douglass's 1860 call for free speech for even the most humble citizens had as its backdrop the violent attack on a peaceful meeting of abolitionists and the refusal of the elite class in Boston to defend them. At the time he was speaking, the First Amendment applied only to federal laws, but did not, until the 14th Amendment, require state laws to conform. And so abolitionist speech was actually not protected nationwide and was considered a serious crime in most of the South. So today we're in a position where, once again, special circumstances are being put forth to call into question freedom of speech and of the press. For no other reason than writing an editorial opinion in a college student newspaper, urging the university to withhold investments that benefit Israel under the current government, the Tufts graduate student Rumeysa Öztürk was taken off the streets by masked plainclothes agents and sent under cover of night to a remote prison in Louisiana, where she was held for more than 6 weeks before a judge recently ordered her release. In response, Tufts University Friends of Israel, a staunch pro-Israel group, published a strongly worded op-ed that stated their disagreement with Öztürk while defending her right to express her opinion. Let us be clear, they wrote, we strongly oppose the content of the op-ed that Öztürk co-authored last year, but restricting freedom of speech is flat out undemocratic and un-American. Freedom of speech in a democracy is sacred. It assures that dissent is heard, the people can express themselves. If any of us do not have the right to speak freely, they concluded, then none of us have freedom of speech. We need not only the courage to speak freely ourselves, but perhaps more important, to defend the rights of the least powerful when they are under attack, even if we don't agree with their views. As we lead up to Memorial Day, Archibald MacLeish so poignantly reminds us that the young dead soldiers do not speak except in their silence. Now, give them their meaning. We are left with the responsibility of giving meaning to those who have fought and died for our rights, and there's no better way to do so than to assert those rights. Margaret Atwood, one of the most frequently banned authors, recently accepted the Freedom to Publish Prize at the British Book Awards. And in her acceptance speech, she said, "Words are our earliest human technology. Like water, they appear insubstantial, but like water, they can generate tremendous power." I would add that trying to stop the flow of words is like trying to stop the flow of water. Perhaps temporarily successful, but ultimately futile. Speaking the truth, expressing ourselves, not letting others tell us what to say and not say, or what to think and not think, or who to be or not be. These are not only political, but spiritual values, deeply rooted in our free Unitarian Universalist faith, and they need to be asserted now more than ever. So be it. Amen.